And today we are talking with Stephen Batchelor. I am at a chateau in France. We stay at this little gîte, which is sort of like a small little guest house on this chateau. We've been here for a few weeks. We went to Plum Village for a retreat, and then I stayed to write a bit, finishing up my book on wise effort and a book that I'm working on with Katie Bowman, and meet up with some friends. Stephen Batchelor is one of them. So I met Stephen last year. He is a former Zen monk. He's an author of numerous books, a Buddhist scholar, and he's really cultivated and formed this concept called secular Buddhism. There's misconceptions about secular Buddhism. A lot of people think of secular Buddhism as sort of Buddhism without any ethics, but actually secular Buddhism is all about ethics. It's all about the principles of Buddhism without the religion attached. So it has a lot of emphasis on your actions, how you are being and behaving in the world, your relationship with your mind, and not so fused or attached with the belief systems that maybe are embedded in traditional Buddhist practices. I interviewed him last year about the art of solitude and about creativity. And this year we are talking about something called the 4 tasks. Now, the 4 tasks are related to the 4 noble truths. You may be familiar with those. And Stephen Batchelor will share a little bit about the 4 noble truths, which are sort of the foundation of Buddhism. But what I like about these tasks is that they're less about sort of the dogma of truth and more about what you can do in your life, how you can take action or inaction, which is sometimes an action, to grow the life that you want to grow, to be the person that you want to be, to help contribute to a better world and a better planet. The 4 tasks are quite simple. The first one is embracing life. While we were doing this interview, Stephen and I were sitting down having tea. It's a little intimidating to serve a British person tea. I got it all wrong. I didn't have the saucer. I didn't have the right kind of tea. I forgot the milk, but we did it anyway. So we're sitting down having tea. I set up this beautiful spot, as you can see, in the shade. And not that long into our interview, a family of 4 French people came down with their glasses of wine and sat right next to us and started talking. Now, my microphones are pretty good, but you'll probably hear them in the background. And it was an opportunity for us to let go and embrace life. It doesn't mean you have to like it. It doesn't mean you have to stay there. We could have gotten up and moved, but we decided to give it a chance. But embracing life is embracing the messiness, the dukkha, the discomfort that just comes with being a human. It's full of all sorts of stuff, and a lot of it we don't like. So that's the first task, and we were kind of living it out right there in this interview. The second task has to do with noticing your reactivity, being with it without acting on it, just being with reactivity. And, we're all a little reactive right now, especially with the stressors around elections coming up and just life changes that we're going through. And what was funny was my husband said to me the other day, he said, I think this book is helping you because I'm noticing you're actually, you're getting stressed, but then you're not reacting. You're changing. This stuff works. So wise effort, it does work. This is the second task, notice without acting. The third task has to do with cultivating those spaces where there's stillness, where there's peace. Maybe that's through formal cultivation of them or just being aware when they show up and lingering on them a little bit more. We talk a lot about this in the podcast of savoring, but also the practice of finding the stillness within. That's why I go on retreat. That's why I lead retreats. That's why I do a lot of the practices that I do in terms of meditation and yoga and all those things, is that we need to build that up within ourselves. It doesn't have to be a formal practice, but you do need to do it on a regular basis. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the fourth task has to do with being a good human, practicing wise speech and wise intention and wise mindfulness. This is the following of, people call the Eightfold Path of Awakening, but it doesn't have to be Buddhist. It can be more about your values, about living out the type of person you want to be. So when you do these 4 tasks, right, when you do it with your kids or you do it with somebody in the grocery store or you do it while you're having an interview with Stephen Batchelor in the south of France, whatever way you do it, you will notice it impacts you. You end up acting differently, maybe a little bit kinder, maybe a little bit more like someone that you feel proud of, and you're engaging really in wise effort. I love this intersection between psychology and contemplative practice when they come together. I love things when they are simple, and I love things when they are applied. So you'll find that these 4 tasks are pretty simple, something you can apply. Have you ever thought about taking a retreat? I want you to come with me to Blue Spirit, April 12th through 19th, 2025. When you go on retreat, you get a chance to remember who you really are. You reset your habits, have a deep physical restoration, a mental break, develop some really good relationships and connections, and you get a chance to work on the Wise Effort program with me. I have an all-new program that guides you through the 3 main principles of wise effort so that you can stop spinning your wheels, put your energy in the places that matter to you, and come back feeling recharged, recentered, and ready to live the life that you really want to live. Put your energy where you want it to go. Come with me to April. It's all in an incredible setting, right on the coastline of Nosara, Costa Rica, private beach. Blue Spirit, Costa Rica is one of the premier retreat centers in the world. I've been to a lot of them, and this one is hands down one of my favorites. It's just steps to the ocean where you can swim every day. I like to swim twice a day. You can go on beautiful long walks along the beach. You can get body treatments. There's a whole longevity center and 3 meals a day of incredible nutritious food that is all included. Come with me to Costa Rica. If you're hesitant, just go check it out at wiseeffort.com/Costa Rica. You'll get a little sense of what's there. Don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions, and I hope that you'll make it. This is a skill building episode in some ways. Enjoy this conversation with Stephen Batchelor. And one last thing, at the end, he got cut off on that last task, the number 4, that has to do with living out your values, being the type of person you want to be, making an impact on the world. You know what those are. You know what that looks like. We've done a lot of work on values on this show, but that's really what the crux of the matter is. And when you do those first 3 tasks of embracing suffering, of noticing your activity without reacting, of finding those still spaces, you're much more capable, much more able, much more supported in living out your values. All right, enjoy this episode with Stephen Batchelor.
I think of all of the things that I've learned from Buddhism, the discovery of these 4 tasks is probably the most important thing of everything, because it actually allows you to reconfigure the basic logic of how the Dharma works. And if you put it into slightly technical language, the 4 Noble Truths, which are of course foundational to all schools of Buddhism, what you read on page 1 of every introduction to Buddhism, are, if you step back a bit, you can see that what that is there are 4 propositional truths that are making effectively truth claims. And that life is suffering, that the origin of suffering is craving, that the end of suffering is the ending of craving, and the way to the ending of suffering is through pursuing the Noble Eightfold Path. That's standard Buddhism. That's the basic mental template within which Buddhism operates. It's the core key logic of how the whole thing works. But I've always had problems with the 4 Noble Truths. To me, the 4 Noble Truths are a truth-based metaphysics. In other words, you accept these 4 propositions as being true. In other words, it's a belief. It's basically making a claim about the very nature of reality itself. If you think of the tasks which have to do with ethics, not metaphysics or ontology, the 4 tasks are presenting a task-based ethic. In other words, how do I live? What do I do? How should I respond to this situation or the other? Rather than framing one's practice in terms of a metaphysical theory.
Right, so the tasks give you the action steps. They give you the direction to head of how to walk that path of the Four Noble Truths. And
well, but I would not even use the word. I don't even use the word Four Noble Truths.
Don't even use the word, just
I
the four
think
tasks.
you can leave it.
Leave it behind.
You can do it. You can
do it.
You can,
be gone.
but
Be done with it.
You find these tasks and these truths.
Yes.
In the Buddha's first discourse. I don't know whether you're familiar with it. It's called the Turning of the Wheel of Dhamma.
Yes.
And there it starts by presenting the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths, which include the Eightfold Path. And then the text concludes by saying it was not until I had recognized, performed, and mastered these four tasks that I could consider myself to be fully awake.
Okay, so
it's
these
a definition of awakening.
The four tasks, they're not designed by you. These aren't Stephen Batchelor's tasks.
Absolutely not, no. No, this goes back to the Buddha's first discourse.
Oh.
And this is why it becomes puzzling. Because why, when you have this, fully...
Why would you leave these tasks out? Like, why wouldn't this
Buddhist
be
tradition has forgotten all about them.
Oh.
So, but if you go to the very first discourse, not only are they in it, but they actually are the Buddha's definition of what it means to be awake. An awake person, a Sammasambuddha, a fully enlightened person, is one who has performed these four tasks, meaning they've embraced life, suffering, dukkha. They have let go of reactivity. They have come to dwell in a non-reactive space, and they respond to the world according to the particular elements of the path that are called for in that situation. So it's not a metaphysical theory about a generalized rule for what causes suffering. It's more recognizing how life itself is constantly throwing you situations that don't fit easily in some abstract theory of life. They are unique, specific, situational, contextual. And the practice, therefore, is learning how to respond appropriately to life's situations, many of which are painful and difficult and so forth and so on, but not in a schematic or in a ideological sense. You don't have a Buddhist response. You respond in a way that is appropriate to the situation at hand. So if you start with the tasks, you basically start with an ethic, what should I do, as opposed to a truth, which is claiming to say, this is the case of how things are in reality.
Yeah.
Like, it's true that, bonjour, that that craving causes suffering, which is a very difficult thing to maintain, frankly.
Yeah.
And the four tasks are describing a feedback loop. So it's not a circular process, it's a creative process.
So can we talk about...
Hello.
Here comes a puppy.
Hi.
Can we talk about each one separately?
Yeah,
because there's a whole... There's practices within each one of the tasks.
That's right.
Right? So embracing life has a whole series of practices to it. And maybe we can also make it more tangible, giving examples.
Give examples.
Rather than being up in this, space of these abstract tasks.
It is very abstract,
Like,
yes.
what does it actually mean to embrace suffering or embrace life?
Well, first of all, it means to actually consider not life in the abstract, but life in the concrete. I'm not asking or suggesting that people should embrace life in some generic, mystical sense. It's what it would really mean is you need to be totally open and present and accepting of whatever situation you find yourself in, whether you like it or not. This is where you are. So that's basically the primary practice of mindfulness, essentially. So it's about embracing life means to always be alert to how you tend, often, by conditioning, to do the very opposite. You want things to be somehow further away, or you want things to be not just embraced, but held on to and grasped. You're not allowing yourself to be open to the actual needs and suffering of the situation at hand.
And that can be small. Like right now, we're sitting in this beautiful chateau, and this French family just sat down next to us in the middle of our interview.
Yeah, very good example.
Yeah, where it can be distracting or
annoying,
or this isn't going how I wanted it to go in my perfect setup.
Exactly.
And then you can also just allow it to be and say, this is what it is.
This is what it is, and
it
might be at a certain point, if the noise level rises above a certain point, you'll make a decision to move off.
We might.
But there's no need to, what may have happened to you and to me at that moment, was that as soon as I realized there were going to be people sitting over there talking, I immediately went,
Right. I don't like it.
I don't like that.
Yeah.
Which is reactivity. I mean, it's basically, that is a habit pattern that jumps up very easily as soon as you encounter something that, is something you don't really want, or something you anticipate is going to be a problem.
Right.
That doesn't mean it's not going to be a problem.
Right.
But is the best space to respond to that problem to just give in to the or to say, wait a minute, let's just be aware of that too? Because embracing life is not just embracing the life situation, it's equally, and perhaps even more in some senses, embracing how you react to the life situation. Because you are part of the life situation. You're not a detached observer, like a scientist in a lab, fiddling with reality. You are part of that situation. As soon as the family move in and start making noise, you're immediately drawn in and you find yourself feeling irritated. You might even feel a tension in your chest or a certain aversion to the way the people look or whatever it might be. So embracing life is staying always on the cusp of that moment in that situational condition, and not only embracing that situation, but embracing your reaction to that situation, which is the second task, and letting it be. Not letting the reaction overwhelm, not letting that become, we're going to do something about these bastards or whatever it is, but just saying, okay, that's coming up, that's arising.
Right.
But I don't have to identify with it. I don't have to get drawn into its narrative, which is basically the narrative from my past, my conditioning, my expectations and my desires and so on. I can just be with that. And not only can I just be with it, I can actually learn to open up and appreciate a quiet, still space of non-reactive attention, which is again mindfulness again. And that allows you to dwell in a space in which you are fully present and alert and aware to the situation, but you're not being compelled constantly by a nagging little voice that's pushing you in one direction or another, or it may be an emotion, an attraction or a fear or whatever that comes up. You can learn to be totally with the situation in which you find yourself, but not being determined by your conditional habits and so on to respond in one way or another, to say something, which you would later regret, say something unkind or make a cynical remark or storm off, making sure that people notice you storm off so they can take the blame for it, all that stuff. You don't need to do that.
So this first step of embracing life then naturally, as you described, moves into the next step of
letting your reactive patterns be.
Letting your reactive patterns be. And that is something that we can do on a very small scale. I mean, even just this morning, I noticed all of my reactive patterns. There's so many of them. So many stories that I get into about all sorts of things. And I feel that many of us are even more reactive right now when we're under stress or we feel threatened by changes that are happening in our world. So there's the small reactive stuff that we do throughout our day. And then there's the big reactivity that it just feels like it's more present right now. I mean, maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel that people are more reactive or a little more on edge. How do we work with this second step of noticing reactivity?
Well, I think you can extend it in the way you're suggesting. But reactivity is not just about the immediate reaction you have to something is unpleasant happening in the moment. But reactivity, I think, also has a social dimension. Like, for example, I would say that racism is a pattern of reactivity, or homophobia. A lot of these collective tendencies that a society holds, or a family, let's say, passes down from generation to generation, is also a pattern of reactivity, but it's not something that's personal. It's not because I had a bad experience with French people when I was a kid that I'm having a difficulty now. No, it's got nothing to do with that. It has to do with much more large-scale features of our upbringing, of our conditioning, of our religion, of all kinds of things. And when we say that people seem to be much more on edge these days, we're not talking, I think, about understanding that in terms of each individual person's particular problem. We're talking of it really as our experience as a community, as a society, as a culture, as a, let's say, the voting public in America today. It's collective in that sense. And so reactivity, therefore, is not reducible simply to what is determined by my own history, my individual psychological history. It's to a large extent determined by the kind of culture in which I've been brought up, the kind of the media in which I find myself drawn into, that also I think is a sort of a petri dish.
It's all seeping in.
It's all seeping in, and we're getting encouraged to react faster and faster and faster with our social media, with all of this stuff.
Yeah.
Really very quickly overwhelms you, and you find yourself just caught up in this miasma of thoughts and emotions and unpleasant physical sensations in your body, a sort of a low-level kind of grumpiness all day long, fear perhaps, anxieties that won't go away. All of that is reactivity. It's all triggered by situations, personal situations, collective situations. And so the question really is, how do I deal with it? How do I live with that?
Right.
I can't just switch it off. There's no off switch.
There's no off switch
no
for
off
reaction.
switch.
Well, there's off switches, but they may not be super
but
healthy
the off
for you.
switches are probably not so good in the long term. I mean,
Yeah.
they might, yes, you can have a couple of glasses of wine and you feel a bit more relaxed, or whatever. Of course, you can do that.
They often increase your activity a little later.
Well, that's the problem with some of these solutions, is that they're very short term, and they don't really get to the roots of things. So it's learning to live with these reactive patterns, but not to do so in a way that is purely passive. It's not as though you must become just more aware of them and that's somehow enough. It's not enough. In fact, what we're talking of in letting reactivity be is not that then solves the problem. I don't feel so annoyed anymore, although that might be one result. But rather, letting go of reactivity is important because it opens up a space in which we can respond to the situation at hand rather than react to it, rather than just go on automatic pilot, what we've done a million times, and just blurt it out again. It allows you this space, this non-reactive space, which is essentially the nature of nirvana. That is nirvana. So the Buddha defines it. It's the absence of greed and hatred and delusion. So non-reactivity is a nibbanic space. And again, many Buddhists will say, wait a minute, nibbana, that's up in the clouds somewhere. But no, I don't think it is. Nibbana is here and now. It's something that is a fact of life. It's something that we have access to all the time, if only we were willing to somehow let go and not get entangled in these reactive patterns. But the point with the third task, which is seeing the stopping of reactivity, is to actually consciously cultivate an awareness, but it's also a feeling, it's a sense, a felt sense of what it's like to be in a non-reactive state of mind. And we all know what that's like. We've all had moments either on a meditation retreat or when we're just feeling great with friends or whatever it might be, where we find ourselves at peace. The point of making this into a practice is to consciously cultivate that non-reactive sense that we have and to value it not because it's peaceful and quiet and nice, but to value it because it means we can now respond to what's going on in a way that's more considered, perhaps more kind, that's more in tune with our values of how we aspire to be as a human being, and thereby enter into a different relationship with that situation. So in the case here, for example, to accept the fact that they're having a nice time, our neighbours, to notice I'm still irritated a bit, but not to let that sort of overturn the whole experience we're having, which is frankly perfectly fine.
And what I notice about it is that I'm kind of going in and out of the reactivity.
Yes, that's right.
Like I'll get all kind of riled up and then I'll let it go and then I'll find the space. And that seems like that's our experience of life, right? To notice those moments when we're not in the reactivity. I've been noticing that just because we've been on retreat for a week with our family. And it's a good experiment, right? You come in with a certain energy of your family and a certain irritation at your spouse or your kids. And then over the course of the retreat, my reactivity has just gone down. You know, driving in the car with my husband when we get lost, or that's such a breeding ground for a little bit of snapping at each other. And I just noticed, okay, this would be when I'm about to snap. I can feel it rising, and then it goes back down again. It's kind of fascinating to watch in yourself when you...
It is. It's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
And
it's the human condition, right?
it's the human condition.
We're just evolved to be reactive.
Well, and I think for very good reason. I'm very glad that, there are times in life when you really need to be reactive.
Yeah.
I mean, if your child is threatened by a car coming at it, you will immediately react by snatching the kid out of the way.
Or if you really do get lost, you need to figure out how to find your way back.
Yeah. So reactions are there not because they're bad for you, but because they've actually been so successful in helping human beings to evolve to the kinds of beings we are now. It's greed, hatred, delusion, which are the standard Buddhist baddies. These are so powerful because they're so successful. If we hadn't been good at getting what we wanted, getting rid of things that stood in our way, involving a very strong sense of me, these forces have enabled us to thrive. And again, we see now that human thriving is often at the cost of the thriving of other forms of life. In fact, now the whole biosphere is threatened by human thriving because of our very successful way to get what we want.
Our successful greed.
Our successful greed and our successful hatreds. We've managed to, with the weapons and armies and security systems we have, these are all about fending off fear and protecting ourselves against threats and so on. And we've been very good at that. But we've got to a point where those habits are still very, very powerful within us, but they're kind of past their sell-by date. We don't really need them anymore. We have to live with that history. And that's what I think almost all religions are basically ways of coming to terms with our ancestral past and learning to not just repeat those primitive drives, but to detach ourselves from them to the point where we can not be overwhelmed by them, we're not triggered by them so much, and a space is open for imagining another way of being in the world.
I would say most religions and most psychological interventions as well.
Yeah,
from
no,
the perspective of a psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was just working with a client last night about his father, and the practice of noticing how his father is in him, and how this is very, Thich Nhat Hanh talks a lot about this, but noticing how his father is in him, the good seeds and the seeds also that he wants to transform, and that, same with our ancestral cultural history. There's lots of good stuff that we want to,
of course,
keep doing, that we want to continue. But the intentionality around choice requires that space.
That's right. Well, that's the key point. The problem with craving is not that it causes suffering, but that it prevents us from having a space in which we can respond more wisely and caringly to the situation at hand. It is a blockage. It's a hindrance, basically. The Buddhists call it a hindrance. It's a blockage. It's an obstruction. It prevents us from actually entering the stream of the path. It prevents us from thoughtfully responding to the needs of the situation. And instead, we just say what we've been programmed to say what our parents used to say, think what our school teachers taught us. We just mindlessly sort of keep on going. So that, I think, is the key, really. And that's why I think of the tasks as essentially ethical. Ethics, if we go back to the Greek meaning of this term, has to do with the way we form our character. Ethos means character in Greek. And so Buddhist practice is really a practice of ethics. It's about cultivating and developing the kind of character, the kind of person that we aspire to be. In other words, it's about self-creation, self-transformation, self-development, both on an individual level and also in terms of how we would raise our kids, how we would form communities, how we would come together as a civic group in some way. It's all about forming and creating the kind of world we want people to live in and the kind of world, particularly nowadays, that we wish our descendants to be able to enjoy.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Wise Effort podcast. Wise Effort is about you taking your energy and putting it in the places that matter most to you. And when you do so, you'll get to savor the good of your life along the way. If you would like to become a member of the Wise Effort podcast, go to wiseeffort.com. And if you like this episode and think it would be helpful to somebody, please leave a review over at Podchaser. I would like to thank my team, my partner in all things, including the producer of this podcast, Craig, Ashley Hyatt, the podcast manager, and thank you to Ben Gold at Bell & Branch for our music. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only, and it's not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatments.